Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome, a very warm welcome to webinar 318 of our Centre for Global Higher Education Research Series. I'm David Mills, I'm Deputy Director, and it's a great pleasure to be introducing the final webinar in our four-part series that we've been having on African research in a global science system. And the previous three are all available for you to go back and listen to and read the transcripts of, as of all our CGHE events. But today, it's a huge privilege. I spent a bit of time in Uganda a long time ago and learned some Uganda, but it's still very rusty these days. But I'm really delighted to be welcoming Jimmy Spire Ssentongo. He's just stepped down from head of philosophy at Makerere. So he's catching his breath from being head of the department. He was previously associate professor at Uganda Martyrs, where he founded Anti-African Studies. He's authored monographs, collected volumes on writing on decolonization particularly. And a particularly wonderful string to his bow is that he is a brilliant cartoonist and editorial cartoonist for the Observer newspaper in Uganda. And he's won prizes for that. And if we're lucky, we might even see a cartoon in this presentation. So it's a real pleasure to have Jimmy here. But before I hand over, I have a bit of housekeeping. As always, you'll know this rule. This Zoom webinar is being recorded, so you can listen to it again. And we'll post it online with the transcript of the chat as soon as we can, probably tomorrow morning. We would ask you to keep yourself muted. Unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question, your camera on or off. But when we do come to questions, you'll turn your video on so you can ask a question. You can use the speaker view so you can see who's speaking. And then after Jimmy's spoken, please use the chat function in the first instance to write a question or a response or a thought. And then I'll take turns to invite you to turn your camera on and come and ask a question. Great. That's all you need to know. As I say, this is our final webinar. Jimmy, it's a pleasure to have you speaking today. You're going to talk about academic promotion politics in Uganda, post-coloniality, and the predicament of African publication outlets. This is a topic that I'm really interested in and really excited to be hearing your thoughts on. Jimmy, the screen's all yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. Let me first share my screen. Yeah, are you able to see my screen, your side?
Perfect.
All right, thank you so much, David, for that generous introduction and for inviting me to have this presentation. I've been reading your work as well, which is quite interesting, quite inspiring on the subject. And I think you're maybe even better placed to speak about it, only that my passion is quite recent. I'm a newcomer to the subject, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here speaking about it. And I'm happy about all those that have been able to join us. I understand that the timing might not be really convenient for some, given that it's time when they're leaving office and some already are tired, but thanks for sparing that time. I request that I turn off my video because my internet here is not really stable. I know it might affect the presentation. So let me just turn off the video, maybe until when I'm done with the presentation for the question session. All right, thank you. My presentation is about, as introduced by Mills, about the promotion politics, specifically in Uganda, although much of what I say has some bearing or some connection with what happens to the rest of Africa and perhaps the broader South, as we may call it. And the argument I'm trying to make in this presentation is that the dynamics of promotion in Uganda and maybe in some other parts of Africa interact with structures of coloniality to impede the growth of African scholarship, impeding also alternative epistemic voices and African scholars' internal and extracontinental intellectual influence. But maybe a bit of background, how I come to this. First, being an academic, having worked at different universities for over 16 years now. And second, having been part of university publication boards, presses, being on 2 press boards. But there is a lot that I've been observing over time, a lot that I've come to learn as part of that work, but also through processes of applying for promotion and talking to colleagues about their experiences. That's how I picked the interest to research about this. The study is mainly, I would say, autoethnographic, but it also involves so many interviews with colleagues and other scholars and editors, mainly with 2 presses, 2 university presses, 1 public, 1 private. And just for the note, for those who might be interested to read more about this, excuse me, beyond what I'm going to talk about now, you could check out my publications on which the presentation is based. One is titled, Which Journal Is That? It's published by in Critical African Studies. The other is a book chapter, Justice and African Publication Practices. You can look those 2 up for more detail. Now, I'm only going to focus on the aspect of publication and the politics around publication. And not to say that there isn't much else about publication, but just rather in the promotion practices, but I'm basically interested in the politics around publications and how that influences the choices that African scholars make on where to publish and on what kind of experiences get to be shared and what kinds of experiences are suffocated by those practices. And this would require first that we get an idea, a picture of what happens in these public promotion processes from the time when one applies, when you tender in your application for promotion. Of course, the publications would have to be checked for quality. Not that anything that would be submitted can pass, but these quality checks can be looked at in a number of ways. One, the genuine checks, for lack of a better word, genuine in a sense that you're trying to see if the work went through a peer review process, if the journal where it's published is credible, in quotes, because you might talk about it being published in predatory journals, but there are as well problems with the word predatory, so I'll try to avoid it because of its own politics. David has written much more about this. You can look up his publications on predatory publishing and some of the other nuances around it that are often not reflected when we just dismiss journals as predatory. Now, in the quality checks, beyond looking out to see if the articles that are submitted for promotion are of quality, we understand, of those who have been keen to observe would have seen that there's well perceptions around the publications that we submit. First of all, publications from African outlets are often received with doubt. They're often received with higher suspicion than publications from elsewhere. That if I have an article in Routledge or Taylor and Francis, whether that article is of quality or not, usually it's received with some level of credibility, with some level of acceptance right from the onset. There isn't much that one would have to say in defense, or one would have to substantiate, even if it's coming from an emerging journal from the West in quotes, compared to an article that is coming from an African outlet. You would have much to defend, especially when this interfaces with some practices that those I talked to deemed as malicious. If there is any conflict, or if there are some power struggles, if there are some scores to settle, one can easily build their case around a claim that your publication is not from an outlet that is credible, or your publication is substandard, especially if it's from an outlet that is African or that is Asian. You can see that reflected in the cartoon there on the side. The glee with which a Western publication is received, and the kind of doubt on the face when it's from an African outlet. Part of what I'm going to show is that ultimately, when you observe that maybe at your first application, or what you heard from a colleague, that their publication was received with such doubt, this becomes an incentive for publishing elsewhere. This becomes a drive, a motivation for you to look for other outlets that are going to make the process smoother for you. And definitely this means that you would better consider publishing from outside Africa. And ultimately this is going to affect what gets into African journals, what gets into books published in Africa, through the politics, the calculations of considering where to publish or not. And that's why some people have said, and this is specifically coming from Nyamunjo, that you might publish and still perish. You might publish in African outlets, but you'll perish in terms of the promotion. If that's what you're looking for, you might not get promoted, despite the fact that you could have published even extensively. So now we have to consider, first of all, that the quality checks are important. The argument I'm making is not that we have to do away with the quality checks, or we have to bring the bar lower for us to include even what might come from African outlets that is not really up to standard. But we also need to consider the circumstances under which African publication outlets thrive, African publishing houses. This may not be generalized in contexts like South Africa. I know it's a bit different. Some of the university presses, they are thriving quite maybe with relative comfort. Maybe in North Africa, it could be different, but in most of sub-Saharan Africa, publishing houses are under-resourced, they are understaffed, they suffer with poor reading cultures. Much of what they bring out is not really read. Suffering from editorial challenges, to getting reviewers is quite a challenge. Reviewers that are able to do a good job, getting people that can can run the editorial processes itself is not really easy. And the quality of submissions, here there is an interesting dynamic. Some of the people I talked to said that, confess that usually when they write an article, a chapter that they consider to be quite strong, they'll first consider using an outlet in the West that is regarded as strong, that is regarded as high impact factor, or as of a higher standing. But if they feel that their manuscript is weak, then they'll consider sending it to an African outlet because they think that the weak draft stands a higher chance of getting published. That means that by and large, the quality that you'll get, the submissions that you'll get, will be of the kind that even when they are out, they are going to add to this stereotype that the products of African publication outlets, that the quality is low. The marketing and distribution shortfalls that they face, visibility, you find that many of them are not even on the internet due to structure and other institutional challenges. And if you're not on the internet, it's affecting your citation, the citation indices that are used to rank which publication, which journal is of higher standing, which one is a medium of no standard at all. So many of them are not visible. Even of highly reputable universities, you'll find that they have journals that are not seen anywhere. And sometimes this contributes to their being categorized as predatory journals when they're actually not. So all these challenges contribute in many ways in reinforcing the biases, both the quality checks that are genuine, but also the circumstances of the publishers that may not permit them to be up to standard to produce quality work. One of the ways in which we could look at the perceptions around African publications, what drives the way in which we look at publications coming out of our houses. I think it can be related to coloniality or to our colonial experiences and some of their legacies. Colonialism had, we could say, a dual effect. It could even be more than that, but the most outstanding is that amongst some, it produces abhorrence in a way that they end up hating everything that is associated with imperial systems, imperial structures, or with whoever is regarded as an imperialist or as a driver of the imperialist agenda. But on the other hand, it produces internalization, or sometimes a blend of the two, both abhorrence and internalization, which could be implicit or explicit, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. But where there is internalization, and which is mostly of my interest here, you observe a lot of imitation of whiteness and all associated with it, together with an attendant disdain for blackness and whatever it comes along with. The subject here has an eroded confidence that does not really permit them to look at their own products as of value. There are so many jokes around here about products in Uganda. Some people will ask, is it made in UK? The moment you say, made in UK, made in England, it automatically means that it's better than whatever is made in Uganda, whatever is made from elsewhere in Africa. That you see this even in the naming of schools, London College of this, Cambridge that, because association with such names, such places, or association with a former colonizer, former still colonizing country, it comes with a certain aura, it comes with a certain degree of confidence that what is associated with it is good. This can be seen even in publication. And in fact, what I wanted here is to show that the perceptions we'll observe around African publications are not really exclusive to the publications. There are things that we as well observe elsewhere in how we treat things that are African, in how we treat things that come from within. Certainly here we shall still acknowledge that this interacts with quality flaws, with gaps that indeed also influence how we look at things from Africa. But it's not always the case. Sometimes this is a product of the indoctrination. It's a product of how our consciences have been cultivated in such a way that we are externalized, that we are alienated from our being, alienated from appreciation of who we are and what is produced from within our context. So the conscious and unconscious ambition of the formerly colonized eventually becomes, or it became, that of achieving equality with the splendid mode of the colonizer and to look like him or her to the point of disappearing in them. This observation was made by Memi far back in 1974. Much of it was as well said observed by Fanon, but it still continues. This imitation can be seen in many circles. Some of the academics I talked to told me that publishing in an African outlet comes with low reputation, you become despised even by your own colleagues. If someone asks where the journal where you published and you mention something from maybe Makerere University, from Uganda Matters University, there is some sort of a sentiment that comes with it. Someone immediately thinking that, okay, if it's published there, then there must be a quality gap somewhere. But the moment you mention, oh, it's with Taylor and Francis, immediately one would have to nod, one would have to shake their head in admission that indeed that has to be high quality work. Those perceptions interact with hegemonic structures within which many of our institutions are still situated. The power configurations between the North and the South, where the North mainly sets the standards, and the work of the South in many ways is to follow those standards. One would ask, why would the South have to follow those standards if they do not agree with them? It's more complex than that because, and there are many people who have tried, but when you try, you're defined out of existence. As Sadal has observed, the greatest power of the North is in their capacity to define what is science, to define what is knowledge, to define what is what scholarship is, to define what a university is. And if you fall outside the frame of those definitions that are structured within the North, then it would mean that you might not get collaborations, you might not get universities in the North to work with. And if you're in a context that is already constrained financially, it might eventually lead to folding. So in many ways, institutions from the South would have to, in one way or the other, trim some of their ambitions that are not in line with that hegemonic path that is set by the more powerful. So Northern universalisms are reproducing monolithic academic traditions that entangle Southern institutions and academics into unjust, even if internalized or even if they seem to be accepted, but they still remain violent practices. And in many ways, when you observe, you might feel or think that there is a semblance of free agents, that these are things that are freely chosen. These are structures within institutions from the South, academics from the South choose to fit in, but it's not really as free as it appears. It's mostly out of a fear of being defined out of existence, a fear of being excluded as an outsider, or as one that is seen to be doing something that is not within the orthodoxies. Once you're pushed outside your context, or once you're dissuaded from publishing with African outlets, and the only option you have in order for you to get the credibility, in order for you to get the reputation that you crave for to be promoted, you're left with one option of publishing in the West. But even in the West, they'll have to exercise their knowledge gatekeeping. And it's not something that I would fault per se, because every publisher would have their own interests, and it's that interest that drives or defines what they take to be the standards of what they do not accept. So where African academics publish would affect what they can research and publish, what counts as knowledge, and what is worth publishing. The interests of the publisher would in many ways define this. The theoretical lenses that you can use, that you can be permitted to deploy in making sense of your work, the methodologies that you can adopt, or methodologies that are not acceptable. If you don't do that, it's automatic. What happens? You'll get rejections until you come back to the line, until you accept the standards that are drawn out to you. So to publish in metropolitan journals, one must write in metropolitan genres. cite metropolitan literature and become part of the metropolitan discourse. There are certain names at times that you cite, and editors very politely suggest that, no, here you might need to suggest this. A reviewer says, I think instead of citing so and so, it would have been better that you cite this or that. At times it's out of what they know, but sometimes it's out of that gatekeeping of what theory, of what scholar they think is of a certain standing to be cited when you're talking about something. And as such, this means that there is as well a sieving of what knowledge gets to be cited repeatedly, of what sources receive attention and what sources do not have to get that attention. So the choices of scholars from the periphery are also shaped by a fear or the possibility, which I talked about earlier, being defined out of scholarly experience. As Frantz Fanon puts it, you either turn white or you disappear. Turning white in terms of the tests, in terms of meeting the interests of the editors, of the reviewers. By extension, as I'll show as I come to the end, you're going to alienate your own communities, since it's the interests of the publishers community that comes first. You're not writing for your immediate community, rather you're writing for the one who is keeping the gate. Nyamunjo has put it succinctly in this quotation here, saying, and I quote, "Thus socialized into glorifying whiteness and the universality of the civilization it claims, wittingly or unwittingly, African creative writers have often bent over backwards to prove themselves to whites, even as they write from Africa and about Africans. When we write, it's not to please our fellow primitives. It is to demonstrate to the authors of the universal civilization that we too qualify to be counted. We virtually mimic them in all we do and compel everyone else around us to do the same. We distance ourselves from those who take exception to such a craving for induced universalism, or those who fall short of excellence in this regard." I think this depicts quite well what I've just talked about. The irony is depicted in this cartoon of an African that runs away from their house, which is in a deplorable condition. But even where they go, standards are set for them. The provisions by which they have to be admitted to enter, and that is a representation of the epistemic gatekeeping that you'll find in whatever outlet that you choose to use, be it African or be it Western. But in this particular case, if you're running to the Western outlet, that you would have to meet those standards. I'm trying to be careful in the use of the word Western. I understand that there is no homogeneous Western. The concept Western itself needs to be nuanced further. I understand that it's quite, there are heterogeneous expressions of what we often bundle together as Western, but I'm only using it here in a sense of finding a simple way of, I don't want to say to draw a dichotomy, but a simple way of representing the binaries within which we often work. And what are the implications to African publication outlets and knowledge pluralism? One, as I already said, African publication outlets are going to get low quality submissions, or they are already getting those low quality submissions. And when they get the low quality submissions, they keep them within the reputational trap, keeping the name, the poor reputation, both because of what they publish, but also because of the perceptions that are built around them by those that judge them even before reading what comes out of them. Then the low citations, the invisibility, and the high mortality rate of publishing outlets, publishing houses in the South. Someone put it in an interesting way that the cemetery of African publishers is always busy, because there is always a new journal being buried, there is always a new publisher that is folding. And with those challenges, what it means to the knowledge that we can produce, what it means even to the diversity of knowledge, to the diversity of epistemic expression that you can get within the academia. In the South, you're already getting a surrender of the privilege to define, the privilege to state what science is, the privilege to state what methods should be used in research. I've seen some suggestions of research alternatives from the South, but which are still struggling to gain the legitimacy, that level of legitimacy that can render them acceptable in the mainstream or in the so-called international, which is one other thing we have to be keen to, the binary often created between international and local journals, where international, although it's being presented as a universal, in most cases it means the lifting of a local, giving it an impression of universality, yet it also as well comes from a locality. It comes from a particular geo-political setting. And what is called local, in many cases, we simply mean that it comes from Africa, at least in the sense in which it's used here. Second, there would be exclusionary universalisms in scholarship. What is taken to be universal, as I just said, is not really universal, but it's an expression of a particular stronger player within the academy. There would be more epistemic obedience. Because of being constricted, you would have to obey. In order for you to be published, you would have to accept the standards that are set for you. And ultimately, exclusion of local audiences. Because if the interest is set from without, the language to be used is as well set from without. And by using that language and trying to meet the interest of those where we publish, we limit access to the people around us, let's say in this particular instance, Ugandans. We've often asked the question, who do we really write for? You find that a colleague has so many publications, a person you sit with, but you've never read even a single one. These publications are primarily not for us. They're written for an outside, they're written for the West, but the West which might as well not be interested. But the irony is that if they are not published by the West, then perhaps they'll end up in the dump. Permit me to end here. Thank you.
Great. Well, great. It's perhaps the wrong word, Jimmy. That's quite a bleak analysis, but a really important and powerful sort of coverage of these issues. Perhaps you could unshare your screen, and then we can move to some questions. My first reaction, Jimmy, is that you've really hit the nail on the head around this the questions of whiteness, the questions of academic credibility, the questions of the ways in which these power relations are sustained. Your comment about exclusionary universalisms is I think a brilliant way of capturing it. And if only we all could draw as well as you could, we'd get our messages across much better. That would transform our impact, because the cartoons are brilliant, really, really powerful. So there's a couple of thoughts before I open it to questions. One is that I was quite interested in the early history of a journal called Transition that was founded in Makera in the 60s. And at that point, it was a journal, it was a journal about race. It was a journal about Africa. It was a journal everyone wanted to publish in. And, for a while, Makera did attract the very best writers from around the world. So there is an interesting thing to think about as to how it is that at one point it was possible to publish a journal in Africa that held everyone's attention. And, the debates between Dar and Makera that Mazrui and Mamdani have written about that history of their sort of rivalry. So there is a sort of, there is another history that's possible to remember about the sort of the quality. And this journal was very innovative. It published pictures and anyway, so I'll just raise that. And then my other thought is that yes, this is absolutely about the associations of whiteness, and I think destabilizing whiteness is when you do that really well. I'm also aware that there's a journal publisher, rather a book publisher in the UK called Cambridge Scholars Press. It's not based in Cambridge. It too sort of rides on the trade brand names, and I've written a bit about this, that actually, you know, there is a whole sort of way in which a branding culture does win us over as academics, and it's not simply about international, but it's about the associations of certain university brands, and as you put it, you know, commercial publishers as well. But that none of that mitigates what you've given us as an analysis around the symmetry of the African publishers and what that might mean for the future. So I could carry on chatting, but really this is not I'm meant to be chairing. So I'm going to quickly hand over. We've got lots of questions coming up in the chat, and I'll ask each person to come in turn. Adam, you were first.
Thank you, Jimmy, for the presentation. So my question in short form basically is, I'm trying to understand how uniquely this experience perhaps is to be termed around whiteness, or like the experience of African scholars, for example, being asked to different standards or publication requirements. So if we do agree that like the legacy comes from coloniality, but now many early, you know, researchers or scholars complain about like how rigid and strict these publications are, and this is shared by many of like Western colleagues that I have in Oxford or elsewhere as well. So I'm just curious, like if you could speak to like understanding, I do understand the implication in African journals, but is this unique to African scholars, or is this standards and publication requirements about what's being legitimized as knowledge, like being heavily criticized by other scholars outside of Africa as well? Thank you.
Yes, David, do I have to respond immediately to one at a time, or I wait until I get a couple of them?
We usually tend to do one at a time, but to start with anyway, until we run out of time. So if you do want to respond, I mean, the question, I guess, is about, you know, to what extent is this not just an African sort of issue? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Quite an interesting observation. I wouldn't really say that I have a straight answer to that. In fact, as I acknowledged in the presentation, there are quite a number of overlapping factors. There are quite a number of issues that are interlaced within this phenomenon, for which we might not say that it's simply because of that or that, but just to try to get an idea of all that is influencing the results that we see. The engagement with these publication practices in Africa, in the West, there are so many scholars currently that are engaging with those practices. I've already mentioned, David has written quite a lot about it. There are so many studies that are challenging the impact factor measures, so many studies that are challenging citation indices and the implications that they have to knowledge or to creation of orthodoxies of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, even the rankings themselves of what measure you would use to put one journal higher than the other without considering its context. Yeah, there is a lot going on. I wouldn't say that these dynamics affect different places in the same way. They affect us differently. What you see in Africa, together with the backdrop of the other factors that I've mentioned, the challenges within which publication houses thrive, the challenges of academics, the unique challenges of people who are teaching in universities in Africa, it will certainly mean that even if we are to fit within that monolithic tradition, the universals that are set, they will be treated differently, especially in a way that is going to exclude those that are coming from more further different contexts, but also more difficult contexts in terms of the availability of funds, in terms of the negotiating power that they have at the table. Yeah, so that's what I would briefly say, that we are quite differentiated in outcomes in view of our circumstances, even if we do not just look at just what is happening or who is challenging, who is not challenging. The outcomes are quite different.
That's very helpful, too, because as you say, it's not just about discourses of whiteness. The credibility is structured by economics, and economics is one of a very unequal global system. Yeah, brilliant. Abby, slightly, I should admit the conflict of interest we've written together, but Abby, do you want to come in with your question?
Hi, sorry. I think looking at the chat, a lot of us are very struck by this image of the busy cemetery, and seeing, you know, how many times you click on something just to be led to a dead link, that this journal, you know, may have existed at one point, but now no longer can you even access the papers that were published by this journal. And so I was wondering what might the key be to having journals with more longevity, ones that, you know, stand the test of time and can have sort of ongoing discussions, or is it that actually academic journal models are no longer relevant, and that we should be looking beyond this very sort of old-fashioned way of doing academia? So I was just curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I think it's more about African institutions, African universities, and whoever is concerned about this, or whoever will be in a position to make these decisions. First of all, to privilege African publications, but I'm not trying to say that privileging them in the sense that whatever comes out of them becomes acceptable, or to mean that it's wrong to publish in Western outlets. For me, it's fine, and one should have the choice of where to publish. That choice is very important, because it means that there is no knowledge that is suffocated, that there is no knowledge that is excluded because it cannot fit somewhere, even if it has, even if one can justify why it's truly, it should be considered as knowledge. So encouraging as many outlets as possible deliberately, I think, would help. Many of these outlets have collapsed because they have not even been helped by their own institutions, because of the perceptions that I've talked about. One would say, well, if Mawazo is collapsing, let it go. After all, we have an alternative. We shall publish elsewhere, those that are still running. And this goes to show that there is no deliberate effort at making sure that these outlets, or maybe even understanding in the first place, the importance of having so many options when it comes to production of knowledge. But it would go beyond having many publishers or outlets, even the mods themselves. We have privileged text so much, and privileging text in a way that alienates those that might not, for one reason or the other, might not be really conversant or comfortable with text, or even interested in reading. Many of our communities do not in any way have an interaction with what we produce. If I went to my village to ask my people about my work as a teacher of philosophy, as someone who has written some stuff around philosophy, I don't think they have any idea what I'm writing about. And to a certain extent, perhaps many of us, like me, we don't care. We don't care because it doesn't matter whether we write for those people. We shall still be promoted for as long as we can fit within the standards of those that define what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So I think it's about also diversifying what modes of dissemination are acceptable, what modes of dissemination make sense to particular contexts or not. In some places, even film is not acknowledged as a mode of dissemination of knowledge. If you produce a film or a documentary as a publication in quotes, they'll insist that we want a paper, we want a book, we want a book chapter. So I think it's more about diversifying outlets, diversifying modes of dissemination, but also understanding why we would have to do this in the first place. I hope I've answered you, Abby.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe just one thing to add. When we talk about impact factor, I often ask myself, impact on who? I think it's a question we don't want to ask ourselves. We say this journal is a high impact factor, but whom has it impacted on? Does it impact on our communities, or it's impacting on whoever is citing it, even if there is a racket of citation? Maybe.
So you just muted yourself by mistake. So tell us about the racket of citation. Sorry, Jimmy.
Yeah, in some cases, people would have to, in one way or the other, coerce their students to cite them. And we also know that there are syndicates that are being created for which some journals are being presented as high impact factor, yet really there isn't an impact to be talked about. I think even the word impact should be nuanced.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Abby. And yeah, I think these are the things that they don't get talked about. The citation networks, the reference networks that enable some journals to be boosted. So let me go on. There are more questions to come. Takako, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I think my question is that you spoke a lot about the problem of people being forced to conform to Western standards. And then on your slide about African journals, you said that they had low quality submissions. So I just wanted a bit more clarification. What do you mean by low quality? And are you proposing alternative standards for publications?
Yeah, thank you, Tekako. By low quality standards, I mean there are some basics about scholarship that we can agree on, even when we push for pluralism, even when we push for admission of alternative ways of understanding, alternative ways of defining what knowledge is and what is not. I think we can still have some relative agreement, for instance, on methods. I don't have to agree with one's methods, but they should be able to explain, to account for them. They should be able to justify them. I do not have to agree with one's theoretical stance, but they should be a certain expectation that one can account for whatever they choose as their theoretical lens within which they look at things, and many others. And even if you decide not to operate within the conventions, the so-called international conventions, you should be able to account for the alternatives that you come up with. I think that's basically what I mean by quality, and of course certain other things about how you present, how you make arguments, how you support your claims. You get so many publications that do not even meet some of those basics because sometimes it's because one doesn't know what to do, but sometimes it's because they have this expectation that perhaps there it can be accepted, even if it's not, it cannot pass by other standards of Western journals. So when I talk about the low quality submissions, it's basically that I mean. It's not really to say that they are low quality because they do not meet the same standards that we are using and at the same time trying to oppose. I don't know whether I'm clear, Tekako.
Yes, thank you. And my other question was, are you advocating for new standards? Maybe not beyond the basics, but in terms of maybe epistemology or how research should be accepted and evaluated?
Yeah, sure. I'm advocating for the possibility of that to happen. We might not have a clear idea of what those standards are. And one of the reasons we might not have that idea is because the environment currently does not support them to emerge. But where the imaginations are there should be provisions for them to be expressed. That's basically what I'm advocating for.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Takako. Sylvanus, do you want to come in? Do you want to add anything to your comments about the cemetery and the maternity?
No, I think it's fine. He captured it very well when he referred to the cemetery, but he didn't mention anything about the maternity bit. And I was just saying, well, because of this, they probably link to the last comment. We keep reinventing the wheel, quote unquote, and then we end up giving birth to quite a number that also join to the cemetery very, very fast. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Sylvanus. That's really, really right. Pete, do you want to come in?
Thank you very much. Actually, he has touched on what I wanted to ask, but I wanted one thing to say. We seem to be in the lamentation mode, and what is coming out clearly is that it kind of, should I say, disempowers us, because as young scholars, you begin to see that what is ahead of you is actually doom, and makes us give up on publishing. And so it is that mix which he has clearly brought out. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peace. Yeah, and I acknowledge many have said that there is a lot of lamentation about coloniality, about the practices that are wrong, about our educational practices and standards. I wouldn't exactly look at it as a lamentation, but as a conversation. We are trying to bring into conversation things that are often pushed to the periphery, things that have not been given an outlet for expression. And I think the more we talk about them, the more the need for them to be addressed comes to the table, or at least getting closer to the table, even if we are not yet there. Much as what could be picked from here is gloom, there are some few signs that changes are starting to happen. There are some publication outlets that were questioned, where you knew that if I submitted from this journal, I couldn't even get to be received. But of late, following up what is happening in some institutions, you realize that there is some increasing opening up, not really to the level that you would expect, but there is some, there is a level to which you can say that the voice is getting out there, that the conversation is increasingly taking place. And I think that in itself is very important. If we give up and we say we are not going to talk about these things because they're going to be interpreted as lamentation, then it could be totally ignored and we continue in the so-called mainstream and nothing changes at all. But with these voices that keep challenging the orthodoxies, that keep pushing back to what has been said as the universals, I think there is some, there are some outputs that we're already seeing, some positive signs of a possibility of change. And even within African institutions, we can acknowledge, I think PISA is from Makerere, you can acknowledge that there are things you could not submit about 5 years ago as publications for promotion that you can submit now, even if we are not yet where we want to be.
Thanks, Peace. That's good news, because I was going to ask that question around, you know, the universities themselves can shape the incentive structures, can't they, by rethinking what they accept and what they reward. So we've got several questions coming in now. So I'll move on quickly to Pete.
Oh, well, wonderful presentation. Now we know that long form reading things even as long as an academic paper, is getting worse all around the world, including in the wealthiest countries. We've got the data. At the same time, young people are completely saturated by information in new digital forms. So obviously they do have including older people like us, we are absorbing a lot of information through ways other than reading. Do you notice something similar or something different in the Ugandan case?
Oh yeah, I do, even in Uganda, especially with social media. Increasingly, you're getting less and less interest in reading. It was already bad. I think it's just getting worse here, that even before, the reading culture was not that good. Maybe I shouldn't say that it's a terrible reading culture, but that younger people are getting alternatives or more convenient ways of accessing information. Instead of looking up a book, there are ways in which they share them in social media or other alternative ways. And perhaps if part of your question is, shouldn't we then also rethink our dissemination modes? I think, yeah, indeed, this is in one way an invitation to do that, but in another way to be careful, because some of these are waves that come and go. If you're swayed immediately to say that now the thing is social media, why should we continue traditionally with journal articles that are not read within a short time, would be coming back to text? So I think, yes, we should continue studying the trends of interest in knowledge absorption, in knowledge access, but also be careful of how we adapt to them.
Yep.
Great. We're all right and right, we don't read. We're beginning to run out of time, so I'm going to ask the last few people to perhaps join in and collect all these three questions together, or comments, and then Jimmy, you can respond if you can to any or all of them. So I'd like to invite Milton Wabiona, and then Bashir Mutebe, and then Andreas Cochrane. And Milton.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. My apologies, I joined a bit late, but I found quite an interesting comment that Spire was making concerning film. I come from the music discipline, and my issue here has been, like, for instance, the field of music composition in Africa. I feel it's headed nowhere, because the publication politics around music is so high, even worse than the one for texts. So in order to get your music published, I don't think we have any music publishers, recognized music publishers in Africa. So you're only going to be forced to send your music to the West, and the chance that that music is going to be published is almost 0.0%. Yet we continue to teach disciplines like music composition, music theory, and the only texts that we can refer to are the books that were written. We have pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and our students do not get that kind of inspiration from their own teachers of the things we tell them. So I feel if we go by that trend, it becomes completely difficult to inspire a young composer from Africa just based on the works by Bach. How about you, the teacher who is teaching him? What have you done? But we have no outlet that can support us in that area. So I think this is a very, very interesting conversation that we need to keep pushing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Milton. Well, that's really helpful about the discipline-specific nature of this. Let's quickly go to Bashir and then Andreas. But Bashir, Bashir Mutebe, are you still online? You're asking about why Western standards are always being set by the West. In which case, we'll keep that question and we'll go on to Andreas.
Yes, thanks very much, Jimmy. Thanks for your excellent presentation, and excellent, however, bleak indeed. And I'm just trying to understand maybe what is the future, where can we go, and indeed, I also have to apologize, a little bit late in coming in, so I don't know if you talked about open science, but it does seem that the recommendations of open science maybe would be part of the bridging of the problem of the mechanisms that have to do with publishing. And then the second point is the question, actually a more general question really, is the UNESCO Futures of Education report has just been published just recently. And there again, also at the World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona just recently, where David Mills also played a prominent part. These major discussions with many stakeholders at a global scale, they came together and had at least one outcome, was that we have to overcome these silos, the disciplinary silos, and be more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary, and especially vis-a-vis achieving the SDGs. So my question is, in a sense, maybe this is a naive thought, but if Africa is stuck in this valley of tears when it comes to publishing, isn't there a potential, isn't there light at the end of the tunnel on the horizons there, that we can actually come onto a new epistemological model in which African scholars might be even much better prepared than the Northern colleagues that you referred to? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. I'm not quite sure I got your last question. I don't know exactly if you meant how prepared African scholars are maybe to come up with a different model, and if that model cannot even be better than the one that we are challenging, the one that we say is problematic. Is that exactly what you are saying, or something else?
Well, I'm just saying that we know that local and global knowledge is the big hype that at the moment. It's the big deliverable that is asked from all of us, you know, local impact of university scholars. And I think taking your presentation or coming from your presentation, you did make reference to the kind of the dead ends that of the receivership of scholarly productions. And I was just wondering, isn't the political will, isn't that something positive that would actually work quite well with the African scene?
I think all that is mediated by the environment. Yeah, it would really be a good thing if those alternatives can emerge. But if the environment is not supportive of that, if we've not yet understood even the need itself, I think it's, and this also relates to your first question about the future. It's very difficult to imagine what that future can be and what can be realized or not. You talk to some people, some fellow scholars, and you get a sense that maybe some are not even seeing a problem at all. And if they are not seeing a problem, including those who are at the table of policy, those who are on those boards for promotion, if they're not seeing any problem and they're simply pushing for publication, simply demanding high impact factor journal pieces, then I don't know how much of this we can realize. It's not really to present a doomsday scenario that then we just have to resign to our fate and say, well, it's done. Let's just play to what is happening, to the politics of it. But I would simply say we keep trying to push the boundaries. We keep trying to show that there are alternative ways of thinking, of imagining. Much of what has been, for instance, defined as myth, as irrationality, or as superstition, and relegated to a certain section of non-knowledge or non-science. How do we bring it back to the table of analysis? How do we bring it back to package it in alternative ways that can show that, well, it might not fit within that frame that we are using, but there is this other frame that we can use. But all that can only happen if, first of all, there is space where it's permitted to happen. I'm talking about permission, not to mean that someone has to say, okay, go ahead and do it, but this space sometimes has to be fought for. It is space that you have to sometimes forcefully, as Mignolo says, at times you have to be to engage in epistemic disobedience. I'll not do that, but sometimes when you go into epistemic disobedience, you're simply imagined non-existent and no one will even care to listen. You stay there talking to yourself. Yeah, so those are the challenges. I'm just trying to show the dilemma and the difficulty of even imagining how you get out of the dilemma. Not exactly that there are no possibilities, they are there, but difficult to imagine within the circumstances.
Jimmy, you couldn't have ended our seminar series in a better way. You're not giving us easy answers. You are insisting that and that the future is uncertain, that we have to struggle, possibly even engage in a bit of epistemic disobedience. I'm not sure whether the seminar series is counted as that, but it's been great to give you and our baby and Ottilia, all our webinar speakers this series a space to begin these difficult conversations. And I hope we can carry on these conversations. I hope we can do more. And it would be great, Jimmy, to come back and get you to come and speak another time about this. So thank you all very much for coming. These are all available online. We carry on with our webinar series. You can always have a look at all the past events as well. Please come again to join us, and a big round of applause, virtual and otherwise, to Jimmy for a great presentation. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.